Might and Magic. Now there's a title for you. It just screams 80s fantasy. Created in 1987 by John Van Cunningham, even before becoming New World Computing, Might and Magic is your basic computer RPG from the 80s. It's a dungeon crawler, more or less. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's kind of admirable in a way. It knows what it is and does it in a serviceable way. The story of the first three games are very basic. It's your general evil person does evil things, go kill them. Not that the games let on about this when you're actually playing, at least not at first. Whenever you start the first two games, you're asked to make your characters, or do what I did and just roll with whatever was available from the pre-generated characters. After that, pop into existence outside the inn of your choice, and now you go kill and loot. Seriously, don't forget to loot. Take everything. If you don't, you suck at dungeon crawling and I can't help you. There's not a whole lot else to be said about the first few games of the RPG series, but it just felt important to bring them up. Personally, I'm not all that fond of them. I think this particular style of RPG is one I've never really had any real nostalgia for, or these particular games have just aged pretty poorly. First few games really aren't more than another attempt to get the computer to play D&D with you. Not an uncommon design idea in the 80s, and one I can fully get behind. I'll just always prefer the Fallouts and Baldur's Gates, that kind of game. It's a preference thing. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. I mean, I could, but then I have to keep playing them, and, well, I just don't want to. No, I'm here to talk about the spin-off that would come along in the 90s. Just because they're some of my favorite games of all time. What better place to start than the first game? Here's a Might and Magic, built off the classic King's Bounty game in terms of concept, but took a slightly slower pace to the proceedings. It's fairly simple. You've got a town with a castle in it. You make buildings happen to spawn you an army, and then you use that army to take over the world. You'll run around the adventure map, gathering resources like ore, gems, crystals, wood, fighting the monsters guarding it, taking all their stuff, keeping with the dungeon crawling routes, and on occasion you'll pop back to your town, refill your supply of beasties and monsters, rinse and repeat until you feel strong enough to take on the other rulers of the land. This being a turn-based strategy game, it lent itself very well to multiplayer, which really I think was the focus of the first game. The campaign is nothing to write home about. You pick between the four current rulers of the land, and thus choosing your starting class rather than your starting race or anything like that. You have the knight, the sorceress, the warlock, and the barbarian, all with their own unique monsters and spells at their disposal. The story of the campaign really isn't a story. There's a few setup lines of dialogue before each map opens that you can read. Now, where you will be spending most of your time is with the multiplayer in hot seat mode if you have some friends over, or what I did to get this footage, namely playing with myself. What can I say? I'm lonely. But when you get right down to it, that's where the bulk of the game is. That's really all there is to say about the first Heroes game. The sequels took the concepts of this game, and it hasn't really changed any since, which is kind of admirable. They found a concept they really liked and which fans really latched onto, and they stuck with it. Updating the graphics, adding new cool monsters to look at, or watch beat the shit out of other monsters. But in the end, this series hasn't changed since this game. Well, it looks prettier now, of course, but at its core, it's what it is. It's a turn-based strategy game you can play with your friends. I may cover the other games in the series at some point, since they actually start adding things like story and, well, story. Even has some cutscenes and, really everything you could ask for. This first game really wasn't more than a proof of concept that later on would get refined over the years and get better and better. But this first game if you're really curious to see where this series began, I could recommend checking it out, but for the price it currently fetches and so on Good Old Games and wherever else you can find it, you'll probably do a better choice just picking up one of the sequels. And that's pretty much all I got. Good night, live long, make sure you get all the loot.